Ultimately, we have a presenter facilitator in the name of Henry Mooney, who certainly comes with the necessary experience to talk on the topic. Having started in investment banking and moved into the multilateral agencies, currently with the Inter-American Development Bank, but previously with the World Bank and IMF. And we will, for the time being, shed the, if you will, fear and trepidation when we hear the alphabet soup industries or multilateral agencies, particularly in the Caribbean, because it doesn't always have the greatest of news behind it. He certainly is one that we would challenge in normal times with his Brazilian heritage, because we know whilst they have a tremendous carnival in Brazil, we believe in the Caribbean, starting with Carnival in Trinidad, Junkanoo, Crop Over, and all of the ones we have in the Caribbean, we think that we would rival Brazil. But we are going to look at the pandemic surge and the evolving policy responses, because as it started out the day, we've heard that various countries across the Caribbean have had very different responses. And ultimately, whilst there was no playbook, there was no right or wrong answer, we do know that it is important that we start thinking about a regional policy that will have multiple components. So with that, I want to welcome you back and welcome Mr. Henry Mooney. Welcome, Henry.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. If you can't, please let me know, but I'll start speaking now. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak to you all today. It's a pleasure for me, and on behalf of the Inter-American Development Bank that I work for, we think that this is an incredible opportunity to talk about some of the challenges that the region has faced. So as mentioned, I work with the Inter-American Development Bank's Caribbean region. I'm the director of research. I'm the research economics advisor for the region. And this has been a year like no other, as I'm sure you are aware. And I think that that's going to be really the theme of the discussion today. So I'm going to open up my PowerPoint presentation. I hope you can see it. Now, the title of the presentation is Impact of COVID on the Caribbean Region and Prospects for Recovery. And again, my presentation is up on the screen, so I hope you can see it. Now, as has been discussed today, and I'm sure that you have all been following very closely, COVID-19 has been unprecedented across the world in many ways, but in particular for the Caribbean. Now, for reasons that are obvious and well understood by everyone in this conference today, countries in the region are extremely exposed to external demand shocks like COVID-19. And I'm talking about the economic impact, right? There are other impacts that are extremely important on the health side that I'm not going to discuss today, but of course, those are the most important impacts of this shock. But on the economic side, we are also seeing implications that have never been seen before. I'll get into the reasons why, but this graph on the screen shows the ACS countries, so the Association of Caribbean States countries. And it shows in the red line the GDP shock, so real GDP growth in 2020 versus the worst shock that we could come up with looking at the historical data back to 1975. And what you can see from the red bars versus the blue bars, again, the red bar is 2020, so COVID-19, and the blue bar was the worst shock historically before that. For most countries in our region, in the Caribbean region, 2020 was the largest shock anyone has ever seen. In many cases, you had double-digit shocks, so more than 10 percentage points of GDP. Now, these are the kinds of numbers that no one could have anticipated even just a year ago, before COVID-19 had hit. And the mechanisms of transmission of those shocks, again, have taught us a great deal over the course of the last year. Now, as many of you know already, our region is very rich in many ways in terms of its natural endowments, everything from oil and natural gas, gold, other minerals, iron. But one of the biggest natural endowments of the region is the region's beauty and sun and sand. And for that reason, tourism is an extremely important driver of economic activity in the region. And one of the things that we saw during 2020, and again, couldn't be anticipated because we'd never seen it before, was an unprecedented shock. Now, we put these numbers together, and many of the slides that you will see today are based on research that we have published over the course of the last year from the IDB. Now, this graph, I think, is quite striking, which is why I'm showing it. We looked back in history to try and find parallels to what happened in 2020 in terms of the impact on tourism arrivals and tourism flows. What you can see on the screen is back to the year 2000, and we set 2000 as 100%, so normalized it. What you can see was the largest shock that we had seen in recent history was the global financial crisis, which was a severe shock to most countries in the Caribbean region and elsewhere. And we saw about a 5% year-on-year dip from 2008 to 2009 in tourism arrivals. Now in 2020, and that's the right end of the scale, what you see is what happened in 2020, which was about a 70% contraction in tourism arrivals year on year. So in every respect, 2020 was an extreme outlier. Now, why is that so important for countries in our region? Well, as you know, countries in our region tend to depend on one of two, and sometimes a combination of two major export drivers of the economy: tourism or commodity exports. Now, when this crisis began, we at the IDB tried to figure out how significant the crisis would be for countries in the region, and we started to think about vulnerabilities based on tourism dependence. So we created a tourism dependency index, which I show you on the screen, and we have published previously. And we tried to come up with measures of economic dependence on the sector. And we included dependence on the tourism for GDP, so the proportion of a country's national output in any given year that was driven by tourism, tourism's contribution to employment, so the number of persons that are employed by the sector, and the contribution of tourism to trade. So basically tourism as a proportion of all exports. Tourism actually shows up in the balance of payments as a services export. And when we put the numbers together, this is the latest data set that we have, the numbers were striking. We found out of the 166 countries around the world for which we have data, top 20 of them, most of those countries are in the Caribbean. And I show here Latin American and Caribbean countries out of that group of 166 countries. And again, what you see is quite striking. The most tourism-dependent country in the world is Aruba, as far as we can tell based on the numbers that we have. But some of the major economies in our region, the Bahamas, Barbados, Jamaica, Belize, for example, rank in the top 20. In fact, Barbados, by our estimate, is the 11th most tourism-dependent economy in the world, and the Bahamas is the 6th most tourism-dependent economy in the world. And the way those numbers break down, and I apologize, this is a little small, but just to put this in perspective, right? In the Bahamas, tourism receipts represent something like 74% of total exports, right? In Aruba, tourism is about 70% of all GDP. But even for larger countries like Jamaica, almost 60% of tourism, of exports are accounted for by tourism. So this just helps put in perspective how significant a shock this 70% decline in tourism was for countries in the region this year. Now, it's worth noting that it's not just GDP and employment. As I mentioned before, the balance of payments impact was very significant and a concern for us. And why is that? For those of you who are economists or have studied economics, the balance of payments is a concept that I'm sure you're familiar with. But for those of you who are not, the balance of payments is really the flow of funds between an economy and the rest of the world. And I mentioned exports, how important exports were because of the tourism component of exports. And when we look at, for example, current account deficits across the region, and we tried to compare that to tourism receipts, what we found was striking, right? That for the same reasons I mentioned before, tourism receipts are such a large component of the overall financing, external financing of the economy, that at the beginning of the crisis, one of our real concerns was that the shock to the balance of payments would create a disorderly unwinding which could imply things like exchange rate shortage, foreign exchange shortages, exchange rate depreciations and devaluations, which could take a crisis that was already severe and make it even more significant, including for banks or other liabilities of corporates across the economy, and of course for small economies like those in the Caribbean region that require imports just to survive. A shock to exchange rates and the balance of payments could have been quite significant. So all that to say, as we now know, this shock has been unprecedented in many ways, and it's a shock that we hope we will never see again. Now, the good news is that we are probably turning the corner, right? For reasons that everyone is well aware of. You know, thankfully, there has been success with vaccine development, and now vaccines are becoming more and more available across the world. This is going to help not only countries in our region return to normal in terms of domestic economic activity, but also it's going to restore those sources of external demand for things like tourism, but also commodities. I mentioned commodities before. As you all know, commodity prices like oil prices came down considerably during the crisis for a number of reasons, including because use of fuel had fallen as people stopped traveling, as people stopped driving to work, etc. So all of these things converged, and coming out of the pandemic is going to have to rely on advanced economies in particular coming back to normal in terms of their consumption patterns for fuel, but also for things like tourism, tourism services. So the good news is there is light at the end of the tunnel, and we can start to see it now. But the real question for economies in the region and for people like myself and institutions like the IDB that are really concerned with helping countries manage this crisis, the economic implications of this crisis, the real question is how soon will we get back to normal? Now, we're starting that process. That's the good news. But the question mark is how long will it take? Now, one of our recent publications tried to address some of these uncertainties. The graph that is in front of you shows our best guess based on expert views, tourism experts from all around the world, in terms of how quickly the tourism sector will get back to normal. Now, what you see is the result of a survey of experts, and we published this in May of 2021. And only 1% of the experts that we were able to identify, and again, this was with the data provided by the UN World Tourism Organization, only 1% thought that the world would get back to normal in terms of tourism flows in 2021. 15% of those experts thought 2022, by the end of 2022, we would see levels that looked like 2019. And then kind of an equal number, about 43% and 41% of those experts thought the world would return to normal for tourism demand in either 2023 or 2024 or later. So what does that mean? That means that in all likelihood, it will take a few years for countries to get back to where they were in 2019, at least in terms of external demand. So the road is still a little longer than we would like, but the good news is that we are already seeing some return to normal as borders open up and as vaccine penetration increases. Now, what does that mean for countries in the region in terms of economic recovery, right? So what's on the screen now is also from some of the work that we have done, trying to think about if we go back in time to the level of economic activity. So in this case, not real GDP, but nominal GDP of 2019. How long will it take us to get back to that same place? So for several countries in the region, the ones that we focus on at the IDB and the Caribbean Department most closely, the Bahamas, Barbados, Jamaica, Suriname, and Trinidad, what you see here is the latest best economic estimate of when nominal GDP will get back to the level it was in 2019. Importantly, what this shows you is, except for the blue line, which is Suriname, which in the current context is actually suffering a relatively major economic crisis that is not just driven by COVID, it started before COVID. But for most countries in the region, we expect them to come back in line with those expectations of tourism recovery by 2022 and 2023. Now, this is nominal activity, it's not real activity, which is another measure that deflates for inflation, but This is an important measure because, you know, this is an actual hard number, and it's important for things like liability management, right? When you think about debt levels, it's debt to nominal GDP. So trying to think about how long it'll take for countries to get back to that level that they were at in 2019 is very important because it has policy implications, like fiscal implications, for debt management and fiscal management. So this brings me to the next thing that we think about that I think is important for everyone in the region, and certainly for policymakers across the region. You know, what does this imply for policy? Well, one of the clearest links to policy is this golden ratio that everyone knows, and that everyone's very familiar with, debt to GDP. Without getting into too much detail, as I mentioned, that GDP at the bottom is nominal GDP. And this shock, like I showed at the beginning of this presentation, of in some cases 20 percentage points of GDP, means even in countries that haven't borrowed any more than they did, than they had the stock of debt in 2019, this shock has been tremendous in terms of how it impacted that debt to GDP ratio. And of course, that debt to GDP ratio is extremely important for countries because their credit ratings are based on this. The amount that they pay for borrowing abroad from private markets is based on this. And it has implications, as you well know, for private market borrowing as well, because most borrowing and most ratings are subject to a country ceiling in most countries because of things like transfer and convertibility risk. So much like the graph that I showed you before, we've been trying to think about, you know, who has been most impacted and what will that imply for fiscal policy. As you can see here, again, these are ACF countries, and I've ranked them by the size of the change in public debt to GDP ratio between 2019 and 2020, end of 2019 and end of 2020. So this gives you an idea of countries and how badly they were shocked, not just in terms of economic activity, but in terms of liabilities over the course of the crisis. And this is public debt to GDP. And as you can see, in many cases, public debt to GDP levels, as I suggested before, went up considerably over the course of 1 year. This is the same data, but rearranged numerically. And as you can see, in some cases, for example, the change from 2019 to 2020 were massive, large double-digit increases in the debt to GDP ratio. So beyond just what it implies for ratings and the cost of financing for the sovereign, but also for other corporates and banks in the country, why is that important? Well, it's important because of the concept of fiscal space. And fiscal space, as I'm sure you're aware of, is what the government has to play with in terms of its expenditure and investment envelope. And that, of course, has contracted considerably during the crisis. But what does that mean for policy? Well, what we saw when this again is based on research that we published, was that this crisis has prompted countries around the world to do more than anyone's ever seen before, at least in recent history, right? So, and when we break down the measures that we've seen in other countries, in other parts of the world, they kind of fall into these four buckets. One is general economic stimulus, so that's fiscal and monetary policy designed to prop up the economy, to increase spending and to improve, to support livelihoods. Financial stability, a lot has been spent by central banks and governments to try and make sure that financial sectors don't collapse. And that's everything from interest rate movements to liquidity provision, but also direct financial support to financial institutions across the board. Household welfare has been one of the other key buckets, and that is direct income support, for example, to lower income vulnerable households. But it has also included all sorts of things like employment measures, so incentives to corporates to continue to retain their labor force or to maintain their payrolls, and to prevent labor shedding. There have been all kinds of different innovative measures, some that no one had ever really seen before, that have been undertaken during this crisis. And finally, support to corporates. Now, that's been very important, and it's taken all kinds of different forms, everything from tax breaks and tax deferrals to direct capital injections and balance sheet interventions. It has involved government expenditures, so contracting of corporates to try and keep them afloat, all sorts of things. So we've seen all kinds of very innovative measures around the world. But I guess what the thing that concerns us most is what it has implied for Caribbean countries and other lower income and emerging market countries. Now, as I mentioned before, when we looked across the world, what we saw was that the big advanced economies, the United States, European Union members, other G7 economies, have spent more than they spent, for example, during the global financial crisis in terms of a proportion of GDP in all of those areas that I just mentioned. So household support, corporate support, financial stability, and general economic stimulus. When we look at lower income and emerging market economies that have less fiscal space, the difference is quite striking. Now, these numbers are from our November publication, so it could be updated, but I think they tell the story quite well. The countries like the ones in our region have been very constrained in terms of the amount that they have been able to invest and spend to support their economies during this crisis. And that goes back to what I showed you before, because in large part, a lot of our countries already had large debt burdens, some of them over 100 percentage points of GDP. Some of them were already in the context of adjustment programs with institutions like the IMF. So they had objectives for debt reduction. And more importantly, most of them have been shocked in ways that are quite significant, much larger than the advanced economies, at least in terms of percentage points of GDP. So what does that mean? I think the issue here that is worth emphasizing is that countries in the region are doing, by and large, the best that they can. In many cases, there have been some real successes in terms of stemming the health consequences of the crisis, of taking early actions and measures to try and stem the flow of the virus across borders. But countries in the region continue to face a real hurdle, a real challenge, which is that at lower ends of the income spectrum, the fiscal space has been tighter than it has been in other countries. So the domestically led stimulus measures have been much more constrained. So what we are thinking about as we go forward is helping governments that we work with, to the extent that we can, to create smart policies that minimize the impact in terms of new borrowing requirements, but maximize the implications for supporting economic growth as we come out of this crisis. And I think that the one thing that we are talking about with all of the governments that we work with is smart stimulus and building back stronger, building back better, trying to do things that reduce the vulnerabilities that led to this outsized shock in the first place, but also setting up these economies for faster growth in the future. And this includes all kinds of important areas like digital infrastructure investment. As we know, the crisis is now showing us that countries that are better connected and have better access to digital technology and other countries are able to do better and withstand the crisis much more resiliently than other countries, but also investing in traditional infrastructure and education and health and all the social areas that will allow the countries in our region to become more productive, more healthy, and more able to participate in the 21st century economy. So I think, in a nutshell, let me switch back to my other screen. These are the lessons that I would leave you with, and some of the thoughts that we have had as an institution as we look across the board for countries in the region. I think that we are very hopeful and very optimistic about the prospects for the near-term future. But I think that there's a lot of uncertainty that remains, as I showed you, and maybe I'll go back to that graph. One of the keys for us going forward is going to be thinking about how quickly we can get back to normal, right? And that's going to require a lot of things that are out of the control of countries in the region that, like I said, vaccine penetration and people returning to spending patterns in advanced economies that prevailed before the crisis. But I think that there's a lot that can be done in the region by countries in the region in terms of preparing the ground for a resumption of tourism, making sure that the tourism product is well suited to that return to normal, into everything from health measures to border measures, to making sure that there's testing available, to making sure that people who are working in the industry domestically are vaccinated. These are the kinds of things that are going to help speed up this normalization process. So I think that's it for me in terms of my presentation, but I'm more than happy to take questions here. So let me open up that screen and to engage in a discussion.
Thank you very much, Henry, in that one. And as you said, we certainly appreciate you taking questions as they pop up. I think quite an interesting set of statistics, probably those that we've heard in different snippets throughout the past few months as the IDB has published that study. I know certainly some of those graphs, et cetera, have been spoken to. And as persons think about it, I think there were some critical elements that you spoke to in terms of the ability of governments in terms of their policy decisions. One question I certainly would raise, and it's more for clarification as opposed to, in reality, I guess, a solution. The monetary policy, which for most of the Caribbean, and you did highlight the current account deficits and balances and the flow of currencies. Most countries across the Caribbean have their currencies pegged to the United States dollar. And so therefore, I remember in a meeting with the Standard & Poor's, when that happens, they say, well, your monetary policy is the US monetary policy because you don't print money. How significant was that on most of the countries in the Caribbean? Because a lot of the OECD larger countries were able to print money and effectively say they will deal with the consequence of inflation later on. But in the Caribbean, there wasn't an ability to print money. And I would just ask your thoughts on that. And when we start thinking about foreign currency management going forward, the elements that we need to start thinking about that would provide what I'm going to call shock buffers that will allow us some flexibility in monetary policy without, if you will, damaging or tampering with the fixed exchange rate.
I think that's a great question, and I think to your point, I mean, it highlights one of the reasons that I mentioned. We spent so much time thinking about the implications of the crisis for fiscal space, as exactly as you mentioned. When a country is pegged to another currency, you effectively import monetary policy, whether it's interest rates or the cyclical behavior of the currency from the country that you're pegged to, right? So one of the reasons why fiscal space was so much more limited for many of the developing countries, including those in this region that were pegged to the US dollar, is because you can't print money, right? So you can't do exactly what you're talking about, liquefy markets by creating a lot more liquidity through the central bank and allocating it either through temporary measures or permanent measures to different sectors of the economy, which means that countries in the region are even more reliant on fiscal policy. Basically, that's all you have left is fiscal policy, right? When you're pegged. And that burden was very heavy in the context of this crisis. So you're absolutely right. That was one of the factors for the pegged economies in this region that constrained their ability to provide the kinds of support we saw in advanced economies. And it does highlight the fact that in normal times, this puts an even higher premium on fiscal responsibility in countries that have a pegged exchange rate. That means they have to build the fiscal buffers. They have to have the kind of credibility in terms of policy that allows them to borrow in times of crisis, so that markets remain confident that the government runs a tight ship, that even though there may be a large crisis, that they should continue to lend to them because these countries are fiscally responsible. And I think that yeah, those are the lessons for us, right? That you know, there are some advantages for countries in the region being under a fixed exchange rate because of how small they are and how they can they trade with each other, and that they're able to minimize some of the requirements of managing your own currency in a small economy. But at the same time, there are costs, right? So I think that this crisis has really shown us how significant some of those costs are.
In terms of the capital markets access, and a big aspect that, which I think was a bit different in terms of the global financial crisis and the global pandemic. The global financial crisis, by and large, was the private sector accessing capital markets because of some of the instability, and governments stood in the gap where it were able to do so. This time around, you had sovereigns also turning to those same capital markets and had, if you will, competing priorities as it related to sovereigns and corporates that were going to the markets for the same access to both liquidity, bridge financing, however you wish to do so. Do you see that as, particularly for the Caribbean, going to be a threat going forward potentially when you look at that corporates are still in that market space? And so where Caribbean territories will be seeking, in some cases because of limited domestic capacity, to the foreign markets, is this one that we need to, I guess, collectively as a Caribbean region, look at how we could probably better access capital markets with more advantageous terms and rates, because we are competing now with some of the largest corporate entities globally?
I mean, you make a very good point, and I think one of the other, it's not a peculiarity, but one of the other characteristics of relatively small economies and relatively small domestic capital markets, financial markets, is exactly what you mentioned, right? That in a crisis, balance sheets are all affected, whether it's liquidity or solvency. Risks go up, so risk aversion goes up. Those who provide financing become more risk averse and less willing to provide credit to let more risky credits. I mean, I think perversely, at least in some of the countries we've worked in the region, we have seen at least domestic borrowing costs come down for the sovereign and corporate. So we've seen kind of a divergence, right? Where there's this flight to quality, even though the public sector has been shocked. At least at various points in time during this crisis, we've seen banks show some preference for the sovereign. But either way, whether it's because all of the borrowers in the economy are in need of new financing or rolling over existing financing at the same time, or because of this risk aversion effect, it is the classic dynamic of a crisis, right? That when you need that financing most is when it becomes most scarce and least abundant. So absolutely, that's been a concern. We have seen central banks in the region who were able to do a lot to try and provide liquidity and to try and backstop sectors. One thing that we saw across the board, and it's worth mentioning here, that we thought was very successful was the central banks and monetary authorities encouraging banks to exercise forbearance, right? So there are local banks, usually it wasn't a specific policy or a requirement, but it tended to be central bank governors calling up the CEOs of the big banks in the region and asking them very politely to extend maturities, to undertake some kind of concessional rescheduling or suspend payments. And we've seen, actually, now that we're starting to get the numbers for this, these programs were actually quite large across the board. But now that we're coming out the other end of this crisis, we're seeing that this looked very effective, right? That a lot of these loans are going back to normal servicing and they're performing again. And I think that kind of thing prevented the kinds of balance sheet collapses that we were really worried about, including for reasons that you just mentioned. So yes, I think there's a lot. I think in the period after this crisis, there will be a lot to think about. And I think people like myself and policymakers and people in the private sector will spend a lot of time thinking about what went right and what went wrong and what we can do to prepare ourselves for a future crisis. Hopefully never one quite this big, but certainly more crises will come. And I think that there are lots of lessons, certainly in terms of private financing markets.
And my final question, because I came from a professional services background, so when you have a professional giving free advice, you take advantage. As it relates to the final question is really on the fiscal policy side, and the graph that you showed with the advanced countries and the emerging countries and the difference in terms of percentage of GDP that they put back into either increase in expenditure or tax concessions. In small island developing states like the Caribbean, one of the areas of concern is capital expenditure, which often becomes the casualty when trying to manage fiscal results. And in reality, the theme of our conference is envisioning the future whilst managing the realities of today. I guess your views and what you've seen in terms of the research as to where that increased expenditure was best utilized in terms of being directed, because we know that there were some recurrent expenditure requirements like unemployment assistance, food assistance, health assistance, and that nature. But in terms of the larger territories, as an example for us and the smaller ones, where did you see the vast majority of the increased expenditure be directed, and possibly on the concession and revenue, foregoing of revenue? Where was it, on the recurrent or capital side? And what would be your advice to us in the Caribbean in terms of thinking we have to spend, but if we have to spend in order to take the countercyclical approach, where is it best served?
I mean, I think that that's a great question, and basically what you're talking about now has been the focus of a lot of our energy and attention over the course of the last year. I didn't show it here, but in one of the publications, actually the one that was the basis of the original invitation for us to talk here today, there was a graph going back about 20 years in terms of capital expenditure for key countries in our region. And to exactly your point, the history of capital, public investment, let's call it, in the region is very unfortunate. For the commodity exporters, you can see if you track it back in time that there was a significant dip after 2014. So the end of the last commodity super cycle, you saw governments around the region compress their public expenditure, their public investment envelopes. And for the other countries, including the tourism-dependent economies, you saw the same thing after the last financial crisis. And really, those levels of investment never truly recovered to the levels before those last shocks. And then if you add to that what happened in this crisis, the impact has been devastating. So you're absolutely right. Unfortunately, I used to work for the IMF, for example, where most people say that the IMF stands for it's mostly fiscal. Unfortunately, if you're a fiscal economist, the thing you definitely know is that the easiest thing to adjust if you're shocked, if you have a revenue shock in an economy, is the capital budget, right? Because the rest of the budget, the recurrent budget, is wages to the public sector, is contracts you've already signed for fuel, for electricity, social spending programs. Ideally, you don't want to compress. So the capital budget is the one thing where you can very easily shut it off or slow it down. And that's exactly what happened during this crisis, right? And the unfortunate truth is that countries in the Caribbean, in this region, this is one of the areas where if you really want to see long-term growth, faster growth, poverty reduction, inclusive growth, that's where you really have to put a lot more effort and resources, right? And the unfortunate truth is that countries in the region are have poor infrastructure to start with. And unfortunately, the region in which we live, the Caribbean, is subject to hurricanes and storms and sun and sea surge, which means the infrastructure that you have degrades, depreciates faster than infrastructure in other parts of the world. So the unfortunate consequence on the fiscal side, as you mentioned, is that probably that investment program is going to get pushed out into the future as countries try to recover. And that's really not the ideal thing, because just keeping up with the Joneses means you're going to have to invest year on year more than other regions because of the depreciation factor I mentioned. And also with climate change, you want to invest in more resilient infrastructure, which costs more than it might in other places. And finally, now that we're broadening the definition of infrastructure to include things like digital backbone, mobile, and other kinds of digital infrastructure that an economy is going to require just to participate in the 21st century, those are the kinds of investments that have been pushed off. So the challenge for everyone in the region, including institutions like ours, is trying to make sure that these issues remain on the table and that they get reprioritized. Because the future will depend on these investments, and these investments sometimes take years to bear fruit, right? So the longer we delay them, the more you're going to sacrifice your growth potential and delay what we hope is a more prosperous future. So that was a great question, and we spent a lot of time thinking about it. And if you look at our publications, we have a lot of information on sort of how these things have evolved and ideas for where it could be reprioritized. But that's the unfortunate nature of this kind of a crisis when you have to make hard choices very quickly. Investment in infrastructure tends to get sacrificed first.
Thank you very much for that, Henry. I think I will paraphrase for you, even though you didn't say it, that the IDB is standing ready and willing if the Caribbean can put together the appropriate infrastructure programs that will have private sector involvement, public sector involvement, and the capital contribution availability or capital market access through the IDB and its various tentacles will be available. Did I take liberties, or is that fair?
I think, other than the word tentacles, I think I agree with everything that you said, and I think you made a very important point there that which maybe I didn't emphasize enough. That the kind of investment that is required, the kind of expenditure that's required, the kind of policies that are required in order to get countries in this region and in other regions growing faster and more equitably has to involve the private sector, right? No country that has ever developed into a middle income, then high income, prosperous economy ever did it on the back of the public sector alone. So involving the private sector, whether it's designing policies and creating the right skill sets domestically to grow different industries in terms of directing that public investment along with private sector input into the right areas, that has to involve the private sector. So I think, so in that respect, you summarized it perfectly well. And the IDB does stand ready to provide financing, but also technical assistance and support. And as a convener of all of those sectors of the economy to try and learn from best practices that we have participated in the rest of the LAC region. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Henry. I think it has been an invaluable contribution, and I hope that our participants have seen, while sobering in the analysis, the opportunities that present themselves, that behind every dark cloud is a silver lining. And ultimately, we do know that there's somewhat of a scorched earth, but that provides us an opportunity to plant the seeds of the future that will enable us to have a more prosperous return to the springtime as things emerge from it. We certainly hope that your more pessimistic experts on tourism are a bit conservative, but we know that that is based on really the trends in vaccination in the Caribbean. And ultimately, we've heard that our sometimes failure to work as a cohesive unit may delay for us in individual territories. And I think to the point that you made, not only the public-private partnerships, but the collaboration amongst ourselves as a bloc is one that is going to be important in terms of accessing, because as risk aversion goes up, diversity actually is a better, I guess, stimulus for some of the investment that would be touching more than one territory and ultimately with the same goals and provisions behind it. So we thank you very much, Henry, for it. We open the audience to be reminded that you can still post your questions. The organizers will ensure that they get directed if there are any that you wish to do, and hopefully people will put it in a context that is open to the wider audience, so we make it available. But we certainly thank you for your time. I will lay down the challenge. I'm not sure if you are a Brazil festival goer in terms of the carnival, but we certainly will lay down the challenge in terms of the Caribbean carnival and their equivalents to have you invited to enjoy those ones, so you have a comparator. As they say, sand in your shoes makes you never want to leave and always come back, but certainly the rhythm and the music is equally as important. So with that, we thank you very much, Henry.
Thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure, and I wish you all the best. Thank you.
Thank you.